Hello there, I'm Leo Water for Kit Guru, and this liquid cooler here is the Deep Cool Captain 240. It's from their Gamerstorm range, and they also do a 120 as well as 360 version, so units of 120 ml. Let's put that over there. Prices are £70 for the small one, this fella's 90, and the big job is £140. So we're talking liquid cooling that is fairly mainstream pricing, comparable with Corsair's the obvious comparison. Corsair charges a tad more than that for the 120 and 240 versions, but you get variants on the theme depending on thickness of radiator, whether you have push-pull fans and such like. This is quite straightforward, relatively thin radiators, and you either have 1, 2 or 3 120 fans, and that's pretty much your lot in terms of features. There are various bits and pieces that Deep Cool point out. For example, the pump has a ceramic bearing in the thing. And they're claiming colossal life for the various components. Figures will be on Kit Guru as per usual. If we go to this camera, on the other hand, look inside the case, the most obvious difference between this all-in-one liquid cooler and every other liquid cooler on the market is that everyone else has a sealed system. So you have a pump and body, you have some hoses, and then you have a radiator, and you can't see any liquid whatsoever. This has got a visual sort of indicator going on where you have this sort of external loop in the pump body, which looks quite funky. Also, you have some glowing red lights going on, which looks quite neat. Now, there is a bit of sort of, with marketing terms, they refer to the pump body, which is sort of a square block shape, as a steam castle design, and the whole look of the thing apparently is steampunk, and the pump is a reactor style. I'm guessing that's the red glowing light. So steam castle design, steampunk styling, reactor style pump housing. It certainly looks quite different. I can't be doing much of those terms, but in terms of the look of the thing, it is quite unusual. One thing, however, is you don't actually get an idea of the visual flow, as you can see in pictures and also in that camera, which is, unless you have bubbles or something in the liquid, you can't tell if it's either moving or static. So all you know is there's something in there. You can't actually use it as you haven't got like a little impeller turning to show you that something's going on. It's not like a fish tank where you have, bubbles popping through. So in that sense, it's not actually a lot of use. It just looks quite neat. Anyway, comparing this cooler with others, what I decided to do was I took a whacking great big air cooler, which is this Be Quiet Dark Rock TF there, which uses two 135mm fans, one in there, one on top. I reviewed this a little while ago. Quite impressed by it. It's quite a big fella. And as with all high-end air coolers from the likes of Noctua and Be Quiet, relatively expensive, but it did do a very fine job, and it has an epic TDP rating of 220 watts. I also took this NZXT Kraken X61 liquid cooler, which is a 280 design, so 2x140, and I don't wish to in any way belittle NZXT on this one. It's a conventional design, so two fans, thinnish radiator, but big, and then you have the pump body, and then you have your hoses, so you can't see any liquid. And in that sense, it's fairly representative of the current crop of the market. In terms of what I put in this Fantex Pro M case, I thought, well, what am I going to do to drive this? And the standard thing you do is you get a motherboard with a processor, quite a juicy processor because you want to generate some heat, and you run it at stock speed and you get some figures, and then you overclock the thing and you get more figures. Now, the fact is I've been having problems with my Core i7 4770K. It's never struck me as a very good processor for testing cooling because it's always seemed to me that the heat doesn't want to get out of the actual processor into the cooler. The processor itself gets hot, the cooler sits there chilled to the bone, and the heat doesn't get through very well. And I'm not going to get into delidding a processor. I'm just not going to do that. So what I decided to do was this. I took two processor motherboard combos. I took this, which is a Gigabyte 990 FXA UD3 motherboard. Sorry, that's a Sabertooth. That's the board that's in there. Along with an AMD FX 9590 CPU, which is their absurdly monstro 8-core 4.7 GHz turbos to 5 GHz, outrageously juicy 220 watt TDP processor. It's absurd. In this context, it's perfect. because I want something that really drives the cooler. And then there's this, which is an Asus Sabertooth motherboard X79 with a Core i7 4820. So the Intel processor, 130 watts. So given that we're in the realms with a lot of these processors now of 80, 90 watts, that's higher than your regular desktop processor. But I know for an absolute fact it gets the heat out of the processor, out of the body and into your cooler. So that's what I want to see. So if a cooler passes the Core i7 4820 test, it's going to work in the real world for most people. If it works with that Intel FX 9590, it'll work with anything you can throw at it. That's just an absolute fact. And I'm not going to give you a whole load of spiel here about facts and figures because the numbers will be on KitGuru and it always sounds terrible in the video. But it worked well. Both these setups work well. The Be Quiet air cooler was phenomenal. It was properly good. The biggest problem with this is it's a big physical cooler hanging off your motherboard like yay, and then getting, as you can see like that, hold like that, getting to the mounts to tighten it all down, awkward. Putting the mounts in place, tricky. Getting the fan in there, hooking it, awkward. Perfectly doable, but tricky. Installing the Kraken, absolute doddle. Base plate goes in for studs, bop, 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 depending on the exact setup you're using. Absolute dream. And you can see, if I put the Sabertooth board there and I put the Be Quiet cooler on it approximately like so, you can see it completely fills the socket. And you can see, as with that AMD setup I've got going on there, that a liquid cooler gives you plenty of space. On the other hand, it has to be said, a liquid cooler, and this is a general thing, it doesn't of course move air around this socket area. So if you want to cool your memory, you want to cool your VRMs, whatever it might be, an air cooler does have a certain amount going for it. With liquid coolers, you sometimes need to consider using a case fan. Right, so the test wasn't entirely fair because the Kraken is a 280 and the Captain is a 240, so you've got less radiator, less fanage going on, but it worked. The biggest difference I found was that the Kraken is one of these, it's got a USB connection, which apart from giving you monitoring software, also means that the system can control itself. It can monitor what the speeds are doing, what the temperature's doing. You can also have some funky effects, like you can change the light in the body, but that's a detail. But the point is you have profiles built in to the pump, and the fans can turbo up and turbo down, and it can keep itself all happily in check. And you can choose, do you want to run it in silent mode or performance mode or manual mode or whatever, and you can change the ramps of the fan speeds. Works very well. Obviously Corsair and other manufacturers do exactly the same things with their higher end models. Works well. The Captain, on the other hand, is essentially a bit dumb. If I just turn that off, pull out the power cord, take off the back panel of the case and show you. Now you can see on this side everything looks tidy. And when I turn around the back, it's still quite tidy, but right here we've got a little fan hub. And it's a PWM hub. It's got 4 connections. And what you do is you plug the 2 fans into the fan hub. I've just chosen to put it in the back to keep it out of sight. Leaves you a couple of extra connections. You connect it to a fan header, and the pump, meanwhile, is going, I hope you can see that, certainly in the photos, goes to the CPU fan header. So you need 2 fan connectors. You do not need a SATA power connector, on the other hand, as you do with certain other setups. So it's a bit betwixt and between. Also, there's no USB connection. So in terms of hooking it all up, you need to hide that PWM hub away, which is not too difficult, and the cabling is all quite tidy. But it does mean that you get some curiosities going on when you try to establish what the fans are actually doing when the thing's running. Obviously you need to know which connector you plug to your fans to, for one thing, and if you sort of individually plug them into, I think I've used an opt or system fan in this instance, fan header, as the CPU fan header is in use. The PWM readout from the fan hub, sometimes you get sort of 2 or 4 ticks per clock, and I was getting readings in the territory of 2,400. I've seen other people talking about sort of figures up to 5,000, which suggests to me 4 ticks per revolution. I plugged the fans individually just to check what was going on into the header, removing from the hub, plugged them into the header, and I was actually getting readings below 1,000. which is what I would expect. 700 in normal mode and 700, yes. It was a bit tricky checking what was going on when the thing's actually running flat out, because I didn't really want to mess around with it. I want to make sure the thing cooled, and that FX9590 is not a processor to mess with. It needs its cooling. But the thing is that the only control you have over the pump and the fan speeds is in the BIOS. You need to select a profile in the BIOS. In the case of these boards, you've got basically silent, normal, or thunder. You don't want these things set to full on because they get blooming rackety. And silent and normal, actually, it seemed to me there's very little difference in them. When you get the more sophisticated systems such as the Kraken or various Corsairs, the ramp, basically, it'll idle at 0 and then it'll kick off, and you can choose how quickly it ramps up. But when you're in the mid-range, you can have the fan running at 50% or so, and it's essentially silent. It was also noticeable with this Fantex case that because I've got the magnetic dust filter on the top and then the radiator's there and it expels air, but actually the system was slightly quieter. It was all three systems were quiet, apart from when I turned the Kraken to performance mode, at which point it got really quite noisy. It gave very little extra performance, however, so there's no point in doing that. Silent worked nicely. What I found was that the noise levels with the system in the case were actually slightly below the levels when the system was working on Open Test Bench, and also airflow has improved. You'll note that the Fantex has one fan at the rear and no fans at the front. I have left this rear fan disconnected, and also the Seasonic 520 watt passively cooled power supply in the bottom of the case, that has no fans in it either. So the only fan we've got going, fans in this case we've got going on, are on the liquid cooler. And in the case, the airflow works slightly better than when it's on the Open Test Bench, which actually is quite pleasing to see, and the noise levels are slightly lower. Anyway, I'll put all the figures, as I say, on Kit Guru. Conclusions with performance were that for cooling the Core i7 Extreme, it made basically no difference which cooler I used. I could turn them all to silent mode, or as near silent as made no difference. They were all essentially whisper quiet, and they all performed well. When I was running with the AMD processor, the Captain, it would be unfair to say it struggled, but it did slightly less successfully than either the Be Quiet or the Kraken. It did, however, do a decent job, and I suspect you're unlikely to be chucking the sort of wattage through it that processor produces. Power draw under load with this system, 280 watts. And the thing is that the Sapphire Mini ITX graphics card, I did no stress testing on the graphics card whatsoever. So basically it's drawing a tiny amount of power, and physically, obviously, it's presenting nothing. It's basically being used to power the monitor. It's the, I don't know what, 10, possibly 20 watts, but adding all the other bits of the system, power supply, SSD, memory and all the rest of it, that processor rated at 220 watt TDP and the system draw to 80 watts. Absolutely, that processor is taking 220 watts. I actually wonder if it's maybe taking a tad more than that. The fact the Captain pulled through that, I was deeply impressed by. I thought that was going to make the thing weep, but no, it pulled through. The other coolers did slightly better, but the Captain did well. In terms of mounts and such like, there's not a lot to choose between the Kraken and the Captain. The Be Quiet, it suffers a bit because you've got to get your fingers in there and get to the mounts, and then you've got to get the fans on. It's a bit tricky, but we mentioned that in our review of that cooler. Mounting the Captain, there's a couple of neat little touches. These 4 posts and screws and such like, they all work well. You've got some springs on the screws, you're putting them in, the posts and knurled to help them go in place. There's some little cutouts in the mounting plate, so the pins drop in, they just lock in place so things don't just rotate horribly. If you go to the back of the motherboard, as you'll see in the photos on Kit Guru, the mounting plate, it's either Intel or AMD depending on what you're doing. That works well, it's all clear enough. These little black doohickeys here, they hook over the corners of the 4 sort of little flanges, and they lock on. They lock the posts in place, they can't drop out. Sometimes with some of these coolers you find yourself basically fighting the thing. You take things off and suddenly you need 3 hands. This works well. One thing that was a little peculiar was that you have to put those metal plates onto the pump body, which is actually quite tiny. You have to put sort of two metal little lugs on either side of it and screw them on. And the screws going into the pump body, it felt like it was kind of metal screw into plastic, a little bit, don't want to go too tight on this, because it wasn't completely secure. It was secure, it just felt like if you gave it another oomph, you're going to strip some threads. May have just been the feel of it, maybe it's me being a bit paranoid. The thing was, when I was doing the LGA 2011 mounts, I still had to use lugs on the side. I'm used to, you kind of have native mounts on most coolers. You put it on and you attach directly into the threads on the corners, put it on, bop, 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 and it's generally 4 little studs, body goes over, 4 thumb nuts. In this instance, you had to put those brackets on the sides of the pump body first because it's so small. That is a minor detail. One thing I wasn't mad keen on was the black convoluted hosing. Much more use these days to having flexi rubber hosing that's larger diameter as well. That seems a little bit oldie worldy. Having said that, it worked perfectly well, no complaints. It was a bit like a throwback to what would be 2nd gen, I think we're on to 4th gen liquid cooling now. That was a bit like a throwback to, not the bad old days exactly, but it's all I think of when you're bending the radius on the thing and you're putting things in place, you need to be a little bit cautious with it. The fans that are used, they have a kind of black rubberish coating on them, so the screws go in to hold them into the radiator. There's no washers or nothing, it just kind of goes up against it, stops, everything's snug, no vibration, no, works really well. At first I thought they've missed out some bits. And in actual fact, nothing of the sort. It was absolutely flawless. So overall, where we're at, this cooler, £90, the Be Quiet cooler, 65, and the Kraken is 115. The Kraken is quite high end, and it's this 280 design. 240 is a tad less. Now, you could, however, get yourself a Corsair H100i GTX, which I don't have to hand, otherwise I would have used that as a comparison. I've got the old H100i here, but not the GTX. The H100i GTX will cost you £100. This is 90. I'm going to be confident that the performance of the Corsair is very similar to the Captain, but it's going to be closer to the Kraken X61 than it is to the Captain. That's my informed guess. In the great scheme of things, in terms of performance, given that all these coolers hammered through the Core i7 without any problem whatsoever, and the AMD is an unreasonable test, and they still came through even though the Captain struggled a tad with it, my question would be, well, why are you going to spend £90 on the Captain rather than, say, £100 on that Corsair? The air cooler is good, I like it, it's just a bit fiddly for my taste. On the other hand, in this context, it's actually the cheap option, despite its epic TDP rating. Would you go for £115 for the Kraken? Why not? And that is the biggest thing. The unique selling point of the Captain 240, apart from the slightly unusual name, is the styling. And for me, the styling is it's fine, but I'm not massively concerned about that one way or the other. I don't dislike it, I'm just not sold on it. I would, however, be much warmer towards the deep cool cooler if it had a USB connection and monitoring software and controls in there, so I could have a fan profile as with all the other coolers on the market pretty much. That would make a big difference. In Corsair terms, that's the I for intelligent, I suppose. But the Kraken, with its funky lights built into the body and so on, that relies on the USB connection, which is there. That, for me, is the thing that makes this cooler particularly good. The hardware's good, the USB connection and the software extra good. And that is the thing for me that the Gamerstorm Captain 240 is missing. I like the styling, it's good enough. The liquid, the red thing, that's fine. The red lights are fine. The convoluted hosing, I'm not mad keen on. The 240, well, 240 radiator is fine for most people. The fan design actually very clever. I like that. Noise level's good, but it doesn't have a USB connection. It doesn't have that extra level of intelligence and control that I think we've all come to expect. And for £90, I think I want that extra bit. I either want the price to be a tad lower or I want that control, and it's really the control that I would like to see. So this is the first deep cool liquid cooler I've seen. I didn't know what to expect from it, and overall it's worked well. In terms of the fundamentals, does it go on easily? Does it work? Does it cool the processor? Tick, 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 no problem whatsoever. Is it the full shilling? No, it's not. USB connection being the main thing, but overall it was good, and I'm looking forward to seeing the next version of Gamestorm Captain whenever it comes along. So this is the Award Up for Kit Guru. This is the Deep Cool Gamestorm Captain 240.